All right, chapter 19, section 4 focuses on President Wilson fighting for peace. January of 1918, at the magnificent Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris, yes, this will be another Paris peace treaty, President Wilson tried to persuade his ally buddies to construct a very just and lasting peace, which is one of the reasons Germany decided to finally sign an armistice, and to establish a League of Nations. But the Allied victors in Europe, very angry towards Germany after long years of war, really rejected most of Wilson's peace program. And things back in the United States would prove just as difficult for Wilson. So in chapter 19, section 4, we're going to kind of summarize Wilson's famed 14 points. We'll describe the Treaty of Versailles and the Allied and domestic reaction to it, and finally finish on some of the consequences of the war. All right, part A, Wilson presents his plan. Even before the war was over, Wilson presented his plan of world peace to Congress, early 1918, now known as the famous 14-point speech. The points were divided into really three groups. The first 5 points were issued that Wilson believed had to be addressed to prevent another war. Such as no secret treaties among nations, freedom of the seas, tariffs had to be lowered, arms in countries should be reduced, and there should be specific colonial policies allowing these colonies to become independent nations. So those are really kind of the first 5. The next 8 dealt with boundary changes. Wilson based these provisions on the principles of self-determination. In other words, groups that claim distinct ethnic identities were to form their own nation states or decide for themselves to which nation they wanted to belong. And finally, the last one, the 14th point, called for the creation of an international organization to address diplomatic crises to really prevent another war. Such as what we look at as the United Nations today, and it was called the League of Nations. So why did the Allies, the English and the French and so on, reject Wilson's peace plan? Well, first of all, Wilson really didn't grasp how these European powers felt towards Germany. He failed to grasp the anger that they had towards Germany. For instance, the Prime Minister of France, the guy by the name of George Clemenceau, he's the guy in the picture there next to Wilson who looks kind of like a walrus. Clemenceau had lived through 2 German invasions of France and was really determined to never kind of ever let that happen again. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, he's on the far left of that picture. He had won on the slogan of "Make Germany Pay," and so France and England both really didn't care what was going to happen. They just wanted Germany to pay for all this. They were just spitting mad at Germany. Interestingly, contrary to custom, this peace conference didn't include the defeated Central Powers or even Russia. Instead, it was kind of run by the gentlemen that are in that picture. They were known as the Big Four. So you've got David Lloyd George on the left, and then going to the right, you've got Orlando from Italy, Clemenceau from France, and then of course Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson. What were the main, when we look at debating the Treaty of Versailles, what were the main provisions of the treaty? So in June of 1919, the Big Four And the leaders of the defeated nations will gather to sign the peace treaty. And of course, everyone hoped that the treaty would create stability for rebuilding Europe and a rebuilt Europe. Instead, it kind of left everybody mad and probably set the stage really for World War II. The Treaty of Versailles established 9 new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and shifted the boundaries of many other nations. It'll carve out 5 areas of the old Ottoman Empire and literally gave them to France and Great Britain as what they called mandates or temporary colonies. Since Wilson had an issue with the word colony, they changed it kind of to mandates, which is kind of like a protectorate. The treaty would bar Germany from maintaining an army and also required Germany to return the region of Alsace-Lorraine. It's kind of hard to see, but it's kind of Western Germany. Next between Germany and France. And they had to pay war reparations or damages to the tune of about $33 billion to the Allies. Ouch. And again, weaknesses of the treaty. Several basic flaws to the treaty really will sow seeds to post-war problems and eventually, as I mentioned, will lead to World War II. By the way, that cartoon on the right, those are supposed to be 3s, not 5s. Germany also had to admit sole responsibility. It was called the War Guilt Clause. Germany had to admit sole responsibility for starting World War I. Even though it wasn't just Germany, they had to say it was our fault. They also, again, had to pay that huge war reparation, even though they really didn't have this money. And things were about to get even worse for Germany too, because they haven't been able to get food. They had some famines through the land and through this war. They are just in bad shape. And then on top of it, which might have helped them pay back some of this, they were stripped of their colonial possessions in the Pacific. It's interesting as to what will happen to those as we move along here. The treaty also ignored Russia, mostly because Russia went through their revolution and they had to bow out of the war, and so they kind of left it alone and actually took lands away from Russia. Russia actually loses more land than Germany, actually. And finally, it really ignored some of those claims for these colonies to become independent, to claim that self-determination. Debating the Treaty of Versailles, how did Americans react to the treaty? When Wilson returned to the United States, he really faced strong opposition to the treaty. Some people really believed that it was simply too harsh. Others are going to claim that the economic consequences alone will pull down all of Europe and thus injure the United States, which pretty much happened. Others considered the treaty just a sellout to imperialism because it really exchanged one set of colonial rules for another, or colonial rulers for another. And many ethnic groups objected to the treaty because the new national boundaries it established didn't satisfy their particular demands for self-determination either. For example, before the war, many Poles had been under German rule. Now, many Germans were under Polish rule. And why did Americans disagree with this? The main domestic opposition, this really centered on the idea of the League of Nations. They really didn't like the idea of a joint economic and military action against aggression. In our Constitution, the United States can only go to war if Congress determines that, and that wasn't in the League of Nations. And so they wanted that placed in there. And because Wilson held ground that he wasn't going to add that to it, Congress continually rejected that. And as a result, the United States never becomes a member of the League of Nations. When you talk about the legacy of the war, why did Germany object to the treaty? Well, I think the political cartoon on the top right there is really a good cartoon of their humiliation, and the fact that they signed this armistice. They fought this war for 4 years, signed this armistice, and thought they'd be treated fairly, and they weren't. And so this was humiliating. And to the German people, their young men and their fathers and sons and brothers had died in vain. The effect it leaves on Germany is just immense anger, bitterness, and this idea of vengeance, and really sows the seed to these radicals in Germany who are determined to kind of get back at the Allied forces for this humiliation. And that, of course, would be the eventual growth of the Nazi Party in Germany. How did it affect U.S. power and prestige? Well, it accelerated American emergence as a world industrial power. It also helped accelerate that social change. It contributed to the movement of a lot of African Americans to northern cities. It intensified the anti-immigrant and anti-radical sentiments among a lot, mainstream Americans. And so in the 1920s, you're going to see a lot of immigration change. And of course, it brought over 1 million women into the workforce. And of course, women will gain their right to vote as a result of World War I.